Hi, I'm Menaka Raman-Wilms, and before the show, I want to share some news with you. I'm the new permanent host of the Decibel. I'm looking forward to bringing context to the biggest stories directly from the Globe's newsroom and help break down what you need to know. Thanks for listening to the Decibel from the Globe and Mail. Let's get into the show. When Canada legalized cannabis, there were lots of ideas for how to make it appealing for people who didn't want to smoke it. There were edibles people could buy, like gummies, and more recently, cannabis beverages that you could drink like a beer. There were high expectations for cannabis drinks, but they still haven't really taken off.
In some cases, it could be up to 10 times more expensive to get the same effect from beverages as it would from other types of cannabis.
That's Irene Galea, a business reporter with the Globe. She's here to talk about the challenges of how to make and market these products and what might be next for the industry. This is the Decibel. Hi, Irene. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, to start, can you give us an idea of what THC-infused drinks are actually available in Canada today?
There is a huge range of THC drinks. You can get sparkling water, you can get dissolvable powders, hot chocolate, kombucha drinks, beer and wine-inspired beverages, and they range in flavors from tropical fruits like mango and pineapple to coconut and iced tea flavors.
Wow.
Huge range of what you can get right now.
So when did this become a thing that you could buy in Canada?
These products came on the market early last year, so early 2020.
So a little bit after legalization in 2018, it sounds like?
That's right. It took a while for them to figure out how to get the THC into the drinks.
So maybe we can talk a little bit about that. How are these drinks actually made?
THC comes as an oil, and oil and water typically do not mix. So the cannabis companies had to develop this technology called nano-emulsion, where the oil is broken up into very tiny particles so that it distributes really evenly throughout the can and it stays suspended evenly in the liquid. The other problem is that in 2019, Lagunitas, which is an alcohol company in the US, announced that they were having a hard time putting the THC in the can. Part of the reason was that it was disappearing into the lining. They would make a can of these weed drinks and go back 2 months later and test it and find out there was no psychoactive component left. It had just disappeared, and
Wow.
That's because it was leaching into the side of the can. But those are just two of the problems that these cannabis developers have had, and they're making a new product from scratch that's never been developed before. So some of these scientific problems certainly slowed down the production of these drinks.
So in the early days of cannabis legalization, there was a lot of hype and hope, I guess, that about the possibility of these cannabis drinks taking off. What were people saying at the time in terms of the potential sector of this part of the cannabis market?
There were really high expectations for this market segment. A 2018 survey, for example, estimated that the annual market would reach $530 million. And in a survey, they found that 1 in 3 likely cannabis consumers said they were eager to try cannabis. But I spoke with some analysts for reporting this story, and they say that the market is only around $60 million today. So there's some room to grow. The Ontario Cannabis Store, which is the Crown Corporation that sells cannabis here in Ontario, showed that cannabis beverages now only make up 2% of all cannabis sales made here in Ontario, and that's up from 1.2% last year, which isn't a huge increase. Hexo, one of the only cannabis companies that separately reports its beverage revenue from the rest of its products, said that its products account for 50% of the cannabis beverage sales in Canada. And they reported fourth quarter net revenue of around $5.1 million earlier this year. And that's up 70% from the previous quarter. So they are seeing substantial growth over time. But those numbers still aren't where analysts thought they would be by now.
So there was big hope for this sector. I guess, who were these drinks going to be marketed towards? Like, who did they think was actually going to be buying these cannabis drinks?
The hope was that these drinks would appeal to people who hadn't previously used cannabis in other forms, like smoking, which produces a smell, it produces smoke, it can be messy. The hope was that it would reach new demographics, potentially older people or people who like to kick back with a beer instead. I think those people are still hesitant to go into cannabis stores. And from what I've heard, often people will buy one of these drinks to try, but the price point and the flavor still are not appealing enough that they would have these regularly. Of course, there are still people who are buying these drinks. 2% of a billion-dollar market is still a substantial amount of sales. I think it still hasn't overcome some of the stigma that is attached to cannabis.
So, like, how much money were companies kind of pouring into this segment of the market then?
Around the time of legalization, we saw some really big alcohol companies getting into the market. So, for instance, in 2017, we saw Constellation, which owns Corona Beer and Inniskillin Wine, among others, buying a $225 million stake in Canopy, which is one of Canada's largest cannabis companies, to develop beverages. And since they have invested more than $5 billion in beverages, the next year, Molson Coors and Hexo partnered, and they have since invested $100 million. And Anheuser InBev, that's the company that owns Budweiser, partnered with Tilray, another Canadian cannabis company, and they also invested $100 million. So there was a lot of money going into beverages around the time of legalization.
That's interesting. So it sounds like there's a lot of these alcohol companies, like a lot of these beer companies that you're mentioning, thinking they could get into this segment of the market then. Is that what you've been finding in your reporting, that a lot of beer companies kind of wanted to pivot in this direction?
Yeah. Since they already have the manufacturing set up and the supply chains ready to produce beverages, I think it was an obvious next step for them to move into cannabis.
It sounds like this could be a pretty crowded space, a pretty crowded market then. So how do the different players try to differentiate themselves from one another?
So there are pretty strict rules about how a cannabis company can advertise in Canada. So they don't have a lot of leeway to differentiate based on advertising. Really, it's going to come down to what sort of products they make, what sort of flavors, how good it tastes. And even with the price point, most of these cannabis companies are buying their cannabis from the crown corporations, which all comes at the same price. So they don't have a lot of leeway to differentiate based on price point.
And in terms of just like money, in terms of figures there, do we have a sense of how big this market is actually? So back in 2018, Deloitte put its estimate for the total Canadian beverage market at $530 million annually. But in reporting this story, I spoke with some analysts, and they estimated that the market today is worth about $60 or $100 million annually. So I guess the question is, why didn't these cannabis drinks catch on the way that some people thought they would?
So a lot of people say that it's because of the price point for the amount of THC that's in these beverages. So the government of Canada has put a limit of 10 milligrams of THC, which is the psychoactive element of cannabis, into any one product. The price per milligram of THC in beverages is substantially higher than it is if you were to just buy dried cannabis, which you would smoke out of a pipe or a bong.
So it's more expensive to get high if you're going the cannabis drink route instead of just smoking. Is that right?
In some cases, it could be up to 10 times more expensive to get the same effect from beverages as it would from other types of cannabis. Another thing that people say is holding back the beverage industry is that the government of Canada also put a limit on how much cannabis anyone can buy at one time, and that's 30 grams of dried flower. And when you convert that to beverages, you end up only being able to buy 5 cannabis drinks at one time because each one is considered to have 5.1 grams of dried flower. So people can't even buy a 6-pack, and that takes away from the convenience of buying the beverages. At the moment, you also can't buy the drinks at the LCBO or anywhere else aside from these cannabis stores.
Yeah, so that distribution, I would imagine, would have an impact too. I guess, what about people who maybe aren't used to smoking cannabis but might be interested in trying an edible or a beverage? Like, is this catching on with those kind of consumers?
I think the hope was that it would. At the moment, it's hard to say exactly who is buying the beverages. I think people who are new to cannabis might be worried that they won't be able to control the psychoactive effects of a drink because it's a new product, they haven't had it before. However, in a lot of the beverages on the market, the psychoactive component, the amount of THC in the drink is quite low. So I think the goal of these companies would be that people could drink a can of this at a party with their friends while everyone else is drinking a beer and have around the same amount of psychoactive effect as you would if you were drinking a can of alcohol.
And like, do all the flavors that you mentioned at the beginning, is that appealing for people? Like, is the taste of it appealing for people?
So I've never tried one of these drinks myself, but I did talk to a lot of people while I was reporting this story, and it's a mixed bag. Some of them I've heard are pretty good. Some of the sparkling water flavors, you can add some juice, mix in other flavors to cover up some of the cannabis flavor, but especially with the more concentrated and potent ones with more THC in them, I've heard that you really still do get that musky cannabis flavor, and that has put people off.
So this is, as you've touched on before, this is a heavily regulated industry. How have government regulations on cannabis drinks in particular, how have they contributed to some of the challenges, I guess, that the industry is facing?
If you ask someone in the industry, they will tell you that the government regulations are the reason why they haven't taken off as they were expected to. Those limits on potency, the high prices, and limitations on how many drinks you can buy at a time, they say are really limiting. And the other problem is that cannabis lounges haven't opened up yet. And these were supposed to be places where you could go, meet with friends, and consume cannabis products just as you would have a glass of wine in a bar. These were expected to open up around 2019, 2020. They were in the works before the pandemic. And then when COVID started, those plans were put on hold. And I've been told there's not any plan at the moment to open cannabis lounges. Having those spaces open for the consumption of beverages was a huge factor in some of the calculations of how successful these products could be.
And so you mentioned cannabis lounges in particular. What about the possibility of selling these cannabis drinks in just regular bars alongside where they sell alcohol? Is that a consideration?
I think it's still too early to think about selling cannabis beside alcohol. Combining alcohol and cannabis typically is not recommended. And in a busy bar, it would also be really hard for a bartender to know what you've consumed before and gauge how intoxicated you are. I think when these big alcohol companies were first investing in cannabis, they really saw these weed drinks as a huge new product that would rival beer and wine. And that's why they were so excited. And all of these policies and regulations have slowed their enthusiasm.
Are there plans to eventually get these cannabis beverages into provincial distributors that sell alcohol as well, or have those plans been halted, or I guess what stage are we at with that?
As far as I know, currently there are no plans to get them into provincial alcohol distributors. I think that would be eventually the mission for cannabis companies. They would love to see their products sold in these provincial alcohol distributors. But as you say, it's a highly regulated industry. And so these sorts of changes take time.
So Irene, we've talked about the issues that cannabis drink producers in particular are facing. But I guess how much are those issues just a product of the larger cannabis industry in particular? Like how demand has been playing out in general for cannabis products?
What we're seeing in the beverage market is representative of what we're seeing in the cannabis market as a whole. There were really high expectations around legalization, and we saw big companies putting a lot of money into developing facilities and new products. And in general, the cannabis market has not expanded as quickly as some people thought it would. Some people say that beverages in particular were overhyped. I spoke with one cannabis business owner, and he said that he never got into selling beverages in the first place because he never thought there was demand for them. And this has confirmed that for him.
Irene, thanks so much for joining us today to talk about this.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
That's it for today. I'm Menaka Raman-Wilms. Our producers are Madeline White and Cheryl Sutherland. Tim and Johnson, our intern, also helped produce today's episode. David Crosby edits the show. Kasia Mihailovich is our senior producer, and Angela Pacenza is our executive editor. Thanks to Irene Galea. You can find more of her work at theglobeandmail.com. You can also email us at thedecibel@globeandmail.com. If you want to reach me, I'm on Twitter at MenakaRW. And if you haven't already, please follow The Decibel wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.